Welcome to the Simply Wild podcast, where we find the wild within us. We remember it, we cling to it, we search for it. I am your host, Sadie Jane, and we're at the beginning stages of this podcast situation. Complete transparency, there are only a handful of podcasts I listen to, and I don't even get a chance to listen to them religiously because I just don't. So I feel like I'm genuinely venturing into the forest of the unknown, and I'm doing it unscripted. It just felt like it needed to be that way because really for the first time in the 15 years I've been on the internet, I feel like I have a place to just share, to just literally tell everything. I used to tell my story, the beginning of my story, when I would speak. I used to do a lot of speaking events. I don't do them as much anymore just because I'm busy with my own things. Which of those things you'll find out of what I am and what I do. If you listen to the intro video or the intro podcast, it was like 17 minutes long. I don't even know if I explained it correctly. So I promise I will start to become more eloquent. And maybe I won't. Maybe I'll just be like the worst podcaster, but maybe you'll find safety. Maybe this is what it's supposed to be, is like wild and unhinged. So let's get into it, shall we? I really feel like this podcast is going to evolve a lot, but it is important to me to share with you, to have a space with you, finally, for me to share like who I am, really who I am, where I came from, my whole story, because it's a story. It's a story. And I'm actually going to start with a disclaimer. I was going to say this later, but I feel like it needs to be said now. My story is weaved deeply with people who have different truths than mine. And so as I share my story, I'm going to do so being mindful of that. And I actually truly believe that there is an opportunity here for us to learn maybe a new way. Maybe it's been done before. Who knows? I'm sure it has. I'm not claiming to have any of this, like this new prophetic new way of sharing stories, other than in my intention and in my own accountability story of this. I believe that I can share where I've been and how I've grown to be who I am, while also being mindful of other people's emotions and feelings. Yeah? Okay, so let's get into it. Mostly those emotions and feelings are people from my upbringing, because I have one of the most wild upbringings. Not really. It feels like it to me. Actually, I retract that statement. I'm sure it's not the most wild. It's just, it's pretty crazy. So I am the seventh of 8 children biologically. My mom and dad, I was born in Salt Lake City, Utah, and I actually still live in the area now. They were living a very happy life together. And can you tell this is the first time I've actually talked about this? I don't even know. Let me just actually take a second and call upon my angels and guides. I already did this, but I'm really feeling like I need to anchor in and ground myself in here, because I'm telling kind of the depths of my story here. So my parents divorced when I was 3, and I didn't know why until I was 12. We'll start there. We were listening to General Conference. I grew up in the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, and we were listening to General Conference, and it was during a break, and everyone had left the room. We were all cuddled up in our blankets and stuff. And I saw my brother's journal, and I bent down and looked at the journal, and I opened the journal, and I opened it up to a page that it just flopped open. And there was lots of writing on it and everything. And on one of the pages, the big words GAY were on the page. And I was like, what is this? So I read it. And it was today, I don't remember the date of the journal entry, but it said, today is the day I found out my dad was gay. So my mom and my dad divorced, like I said, when I was 3, and I never really understood why. In fact, we lived in Oregon City before my mom remarried, and we would see my dad. We lived with my mom, obviously, primarily, because there was 8 of us, but we would spend the Saturdays with my dad. And he always had a roommate with him. His name is Kim. He's now his husband. I didn't know at the time that they were partners. And we would just spend the Saturday together. And I just didn't know what that was or what that meant or anything, like I said, until I was 12. So I learned that my dad was gay when I was 12. My mom and my dad had 8 kids. And later, I found out in my life, I went, let's see, it was about 2013 because my son, Baylor, was my second son, Baylor. He was a baby. I went and stayed with my aunt in Arizona, and my dad was there. And I remember sitting with him and looking him in the eyes and saying, Dad, I really want to know. I want to know. Like, I want to know why. I want to know how. I want to know, I want to know how long you've known that you were gay. I want to know all these things. Because at that point, up until that point, which 2013, I was in my 20s, I still didn't know the story. All I knew was that there was 8 kids. We were living a happy family. And then all of a sudden he left. And there's a lot of, like I said, I'm going to tell his story with being mindful with other people's feelings. And I hope you listen to the whole thing because this actually comes with a really beautiful full circle moment. And he told me that he knew that he was gay when he was about 5 years old. So he kind of told me the story of his life, which I won't share a lot here because it's really important that I keep the sacredness of those situations, right, sacred. But it made more sense. It shined light on why everything had to happen the way it does and way it did. So going back to my childhood, my mom remarried when I was 7 to a man who had 6 kids. So there was 14 of us all together. And it was really interesting, the dynamic. When I turned 27, just follow me along here. This is gonna be all over the place. It'll all come together though. When I turned 27, I started my spiritual awakening journey. Before I turned 27, I had a lot of bitterness in my mind and in my heart. I couldn't understand. I'll say this too. I think I had a lot of bitterness for my parents because I didn't understand at that point in my life that they did the best that they could raising us as children. There was a lot of nuances in my family, and there's also a lot of nuances in general in blended families. And I did not know just how hard they were trying, just straight up. I had a lot of bitterness. I felt like I had a lot of trauma that I believe a lot of trauma that happens to us as children is done unconsciously. If your parents understood that there was things happening, that wouldn't be the case, but they're literally just doing the best they can. I'll get to how I found that reprieve later. But as growing up as a child of one of 14 siblings, where there's a mesh of step and real, they were just doing the best they could. So in my family, we really blended. They felt it was really important for us to all feel like we were all siblings together. And really early on, I started calling my stepfather Dad because he became very much of that father figure for me. I actually now say that I have 3 dads because my father and I, my real biological father, it might be confusing for a lot of you also to hear this conversation because I refer to both of my fathers as Dad because both of them have held really important pieces in my life. Anyway, okay, so my biological dad and I have a really good relationship now. He would kind of come to visit every once in a while when we moved. So when my mom and my stepdad married, we moved from Oregon to Idaho to live in that family, okay? And my real dad would come and stay, or not stay, he would just come for like a visit every once in a while. And then that slowly started to fade. As we got older and as things started to get a little bit more difficult in my family. And I remember the transition from Oregon to Idaho being really, really difficult. I would cry on the phone all the time for my dad. I wanted him so bad, although he was never really in my physical home as I grew up in Oregon, right? I'd only see him on Saturdays or even Sundays. He'd come for like family dinner when we lived in Oregon. There was an obvious piece, an energetic piece of myself that I felt like I was missing. And so it was actually really beautiful because I always had a really deep connection with my real father that carried on even in the years that we didn't talk with each other, because there were a lot of different nuanced family dynamics. I'm going to use the word nuanced a lot because that's just how it is. But I want to talk about these two things that are coming through really clearly. One, when I would call him when I was missing him, he would always prompt me to go see the moon or the sun. And he'd always say, "Can you see the sun? I'm looking at the sun too. We're both in the same place at the same time." And that always gave me peace. He's retired now, but I think he worked in the telephone business, like as an operator overnight. So I would oftentimes not be able to fall asleep as a child, especially when this transition was happening of like living in Oregon, now Idaho, now there's 14 siblings. Now it's like, okay, now I have more siblings. I'm supposed to call them my siblings, but I don't know how to make that work and all those different things, right? But I always knew he'd be up and awake working. So I was like, okay, I'm not the last one to do. Any of you guys always have like this stress of like being the last one to sleep in your room, in your house. I always had that stress. So when I would feel that, I would look at the moon and think, okay, he's looking at the moon. I'm looking at the moon and he's awake. And so I can fall asleep soundly. So that was one thing that I always held really closely. This has nothing to do with the story other than me feeling like it needs to be said. The other thing is that he always said that we chose each other in heaven. So I'm like, okay, I chose you and you chose me and we chose each other. We chose this life and which I thought, like looking back at it now was so prophetic, because I actually absolutely believe that still to this day. And I thought it was interesting that he would tell a 7-year-old that, and would lock in that truth, because now looking back, I'm actually just like full circling this moment right now. Looking back, that truth carried me through the majority of the things that happened to me in my life, where I would say to myself, I chose this. I chose this. I chose this path. Now, obviously, there's things in my life that I fell victim to. But overall, this path that I am seeking and searching and fulfilling. Okay. So we live in Idaho. There's 14 siblings. So I'm just going to call my stepdad for just clarity, but I will continue to call him my dad. Now we're shifting to my dad. He is a really incredible entrepreneur. I actually would absolutely love to have him on the podcast sometime. I don't know if that'll happen. He's kind of private, which is actually kind of laughable because he's also very much a public figure in his businesses. But him and I believe in a lot of very different things. So we'll see. I don't know. Maybe I'm manifesting that. Maybe it would be really powerful, and also maybe it wouldn't be. Who knows? Anyway, he's a very successful entrepreneur, but he comes from a incredibly humbling past. He grew up in a tiny, tiny little town in Idaho. His dad worked on the railroad, worked as hard as he could. And his mom worked as hard as he could. He was the head of the household, and they didn't have literally any money. And I just remember being raised by his work ethic. He was an incredibly hard worker, and I remember him telling stories of his upbringing and his harsh upbringing. And yet he always had gratitude for his upbringing. Now, it's interesting coming from a dynamic of a 7-year-old coming into a family with a really beautifully intense, strong, hardworking father who wants so badly to love and to hold and to support and surround and provide. I think I was too sensitive as a child to understand that, because to me it was really intense growing up, which all came full circle, and I understood it now more than ever. But there was so many nuances, and there was so much of a desire to be close that actually it felt I felt more alone than ever. My parents traveled a lot for their job, for his business, which was honestly so amazing. But also I think because of that, I felt also alone. So as far as my family goes, the 6 other kids that came into my family were mostly older. So I am one of the youngest of my family. As far as biological families go, I had two siblings, 2 sisters, and then a brother, 2 sisters, a brother, me, and a brother. So my sisters were like 2 peas in a pod. They really clung to each other, especially growing up when we were trying to navigate this broken home situation. And my mom was a single mom of 8 kids. They really clung to each other. And so I kind of feel like I clung at a very, very, very young age. I clung to beings outside of this realm, to spirits outside of this realm. I clung to God from a very young age. Even when I was in Oregon before my mom remarried, I remember waking up and seeing like stars above my bed. I remember waking up and feeling beings, feeling angels surround me. I found safety in the spiritual realm, in God, which was such a gift. But in, the wakeful state and the stress of trying to handle all of these different lives and trying to weave all these different lives and marriages together, I felt really lonely a lot of the time. And confused, I think. I felt really confused. But it's not for a lack of trying. My parents did really the best that they could with all these different dynamics. Can you imagine? Just for a second, can we just like pause for a second and just imagine? First of all, let's not talk about even the upbringing of my parents, because that's not for this podcast, but you can just imagine even just that generation, right? And what they had to go through. And when I say they, I mean just the generation in general, that generation in general. But then imagine taking 14 kids and saying, we love each other. Let's make this work. We're going to figure this out and we're going to do it our own way. They were always pioneers in just trusting that what they felt was best for their kids was best. Was it best? I don't know. No, I actually do think it was best because honestly, I can look at you straight in the face and say, I would never take any of it back. And I'm keeping a lot out because I just don't think it's necessary to talk about things that were in the past that were maybe hurtful for to me. Because now as an adult, I see things so much more clear and I'm getting to that. So here we are. Let's just take a minute to just give some empathy and some space to my parents. My mother is the oldest of 8 kids herself. She grew up in LA. Her dad was a bass player. And her mom, my gorgeous grandmother, sold perfumes at a flea market that my mom helped, create and make. They didn't have very much money either. And she's always been the silent courage angel, always. And as you can imagine, her and I also see a lot of things differently. But there's one thing that we will always, always, always fight for, and it's the love for each other, even amongst everything that has happened in our lives. And I think maybe you can get the idea, like you can start understanding, or maybe you can start feeling like I'm a little bit of a black sheep of a family. And that's okay. I'm getting to that too. But one thing I will say, I'm jumping all over the place, but I think it's important to talk about this now, is I've created a really powerful boundary of what I believe versus what they believe and how I'm comfortable sharing that. If that boundary, and as that boundary has stayed respected, love can continue to pour in. And I will continue to pour in my love to these relationships, even if we don't agree on things, because I do feel like that respect of that boundary of the beliefs is there. Okay, that will make more sense as I share more of my story. So we have 14 kids. My dad is an entrepreneur of his own business. We live on a farm in Idaho. And We're just trying to do what we're trying to do. I grew up in a pretty strict household as far as honoring the religion we lived in. So modesty was really important. Respect was really important. Curfew was really important. And I'm actually really grateful for those foundations because I've always been very, very clairvoyant. I've always been able to see past this veil. And yet I believe that because of my foundation in an organized religion, I really believe that that helped me not feel alone. I genuinely do not know what I would have done if I didn't know that God was real and if I didn't know that I had support on the other side. I don't know how I would have survived as a child because even though I had so many siblings, everybody was just trying to do the best they could on their own. And they were clinging to, the sibling that they felt most connected to. And I was just kind of like, okay, holding on for dear life, right? Trying to like pour myself into sports and all these things so that I could just be noticed. And so that's what I did. And I really loved, as I look in my human design, I can obviously tell where that really shined as an ego projector, feeling like, okay, I'm going to go intense. So I did. I was really intense into sports and I did rodeo competitively, which connected my dad and I a lot. So my dad's passion and hobby is like farming, like where he grew up, right? And he has a purebred Black Angus cattle operation, but not a lot of the kids, if any of the kids, really got into it. And so I'll never forget, I was around 12 or 13. I actually, to be completely honest, hypnotherapy's helped a lot with this, but I don't have a lot of, I'm getting more memories as a child. So the ones that I have, I really, really cling to. And I don't have a lot of pictures, but how could you have a lot of pictures with 14 kids? I mean, we were just doing the best we could. And they really did. Imagine, this is another rant, but imagine going camping with 14 kids. My parents took us camping. I want to say, I'm sure they took us more than a couple times, but I only remember 2. But can you just imagine? I mean, some of the siblings were outside of the home, obviously, but I can't even take care of my 3 kids, let alone taking care of 40. I just have so much compassion for my parents. And I'm really grateful for that because I used to have so much bitterness. And they really just did the best they could. And I actually really look up to them. They do not have a lot of the same beliefs that I do. I keep saying that, but I want to reiterate though, I look up to them so much because the beliefs that they do have, they are so true to them that it's admirable. And it helps me believe that I can be strong in the beliefs that I have, even if it's scary and they don't agree. And it's also, I truly believe that because I saw my father, I'm realizing now as I'm recording this podcast that I'm trying to talk about the good and the bad. So I'm sorry if it feels confusing and all over the place. Hopefully it's giving you an impact or giving you something. But I do know it's going to be worth it if you listen to the whole thing. I think. Anyway, there was a big piece of me that struggled a lot of my childhood. And also, I will never take any of that back. And also, I feel like I got a huge up in this world having a father who was an entrepreneur. It was a blessing and a curse because he worked a lot because he believes in his businesses and oh my gosh, he does. And the people that he serves and helps in his business feel that. I also believed in the very beginning of my entrepreneur journey that my journey had to look very similar to his. And now I don't believe that. I do believe that I can settle more into my nervous system as far as slowing down, which is great. So with all that to be said, let's continue, shall we? So at a very, very, very early age, it felt as if there was a lot of stuff happening around me that I couldn't control. And I have always been considered and always, I'll just say I've always been considered a really sensitive person. And I have always been a very sensitive person. I've always been able to sense if something was wrong. Now, I could always sense something was wrong with my mom. I call her Silent Courage because you will not hear her say one ill thing about anybody. And also, as much as a blessing that is, it's also, I think, a fault to her because she doesn't share when she's struggling. And so I would always be able to pick up on it, or I'd be able to pick up on an energy that was like, because there was people coming in and out of our house all the time, right? Not just siblings, but we had nannies and helpers. Obviously, can you imagine not doing it without it? And their sons and their kids and the intricacies of that. And so I could feel all those energies, and it just always felt really, really heavy. In fact, as a child, I had a lot of sleep paralysis in my life. I didn't understand what it was back then. I understand a lot of it now, but there were times when, I don't know if I should do a disclaimer on this podcast or not, but we're going to talk about lots of really deep stuff, including dark energies and probably molestation. So there's your trigger warning. There's your trigger warning. But there's some of my siblings also struggle with this, where I'd just fall asleep and I couldn't move and I couldn't breathe and I couldn't speak. And it felt very heavy. And sometimes when it happened, I'd look in the mirror and I could see literal red eyes. And it always made me so confused as to why that was happening. And so I do all the prayers, I'd listen to church music, I'd do all the things. But I only say this because, and I'm sure we'll go into this more because we're going to talk about spirituality, but I say this because at a very early age, I shut off all of my spiritual gifts because I was so scared. I was also told a lot about the devil and a lot about being scared of opening that realm, and a lot of like, just don't even go there. So I never did. And I really cut myself off from that. And yet still, they really wanted to come through, guys. Those spirits and guides really wanted to come through. And they did. And in the moments when I felt so alone, and I'd kneel on the side of my bed and pray, I will never be able to deny what happened and what I felt. Those angels wrapping their arms around me. I will never be able to deny that. And I'm so grateful for the sensitivity in my realm, the sensitivity to the veil, because I really believe it saved me as a child. So with that being said, going back to feeling alone, I feel like the only consistency I could find as a child was food. And so I found a lot of safety in food, and it developed a really unhealthy relationship with food really early on, where I would hide in the pantry and just eat until I was so sick. And then I started realizing, oh, I'm getting chubbier. Oh, maybe I should start throwing up. Oh, I'm going to start getting diet pills. So this is from age 12 to high school, where I really dealt with this idea of, I just want to be skinny and I can't. And I also just want to have comfort, and I want to have control over what's happening around the surroundings of my home, and I can't. And although I'm not talking about specifics, you can just imagine the energy around having so many siblings and trying so hard to just mesh a family together and running businesses and all the things. So I developed eating disorders pretty early on in my life. And they became worse. I'm really going into it. I'm realizing that it's important for me to really talk about my entire story because I don't know if I've ever talked about every single piece in one specific place. I mentioned that some of the nannies had sons, and I'll just tell really quickly that I was touched inappropriately by some of them as I was getting older and developing into a woman. And I never told anybody this. In fact, I literally just told my mom a couple years ago. And, you know, when that happened, I think a shift happened in my life where not only was I wanting to control more, the eating disorders got worse, or the desires for them, you know, the trying of the different kinds, but also in my relationship with food, but also the desire to be seen. Something shifted where I felt really excited that somebody would want me, that somebody would care, that somebody would think I was pretty. And so this kind of followed me through my high school life. And I graduated. No, we're not going there yet. I went straight. Let's see, where do I go from here? Help me, angels, to tell me where to go from here. My third eye and crown are just blasting right open right now. It's like so intense. Okay, so let's go back to the rodeo scene. So I get into rodeo, cows, I get into horses. It's something that bonds me and my dad so much. I start working at the arena, my parents' ranch. I'm shoveling shit out of stalls every single day. I'm riding horses in the summer, like hours and hours and hours. I mean, I am putting in hours. It is literally my identity. I like find what it is for me. I find it. I find my identity. And I had done sports previously. I'd done like softball and volleyball and I was good, but I was never great. I was never really great at any of them as much as I already tried. I was never really like a natural athlete, but rodeo I was good at. And I put in all the hours and I had a journal where I'd like write down literally every single thing that I needed to do that day. Like, okay, I need to rope Blaze. I need to ride Blaze for 2 hours. I need to practice roping on Blaze. I need to practice goat tying. I need to practice on Cadillac. So when I started getting into this, I'm going to stop apologizing for talking about every single detail that's coming through my consciousness because I know it's supposed to come through. So I'm just going to tell you all the nitty gritty pieces. And I know I'm missing out on some, and I trust that like when I do next episodes, they'll come through. But when I first started, I just have to tell you this story about my dad. When I first started wanting to do rodeo, I had to like really prove it to him before he like really invested in me. And I've always appreciated this about him. He was intense in the best way. So I started learning how to ride, and it was like just one of the horses we had on the ranch, like an older mare. And he's like, train on her, you'll be fine, and just start learning barrels. And probably, I want to say for the first year of my rodeo career, which was, I got into it really late. Like I started rodeo. Oh my gosh, I can't even remember. When was it? My freshman year? Maybe like in 8th grade. I did a junior rodeo right before high school rodeo started. And I did barrels with this horse, and she was so slow. She was so slow, and I was so frustrated with her. And I was using this like little kid saddle. Now my dad is extremely successful monetarily, right? Like he has made a name for himself, which I'm actually going to get to because I've actually never talked about ever in my platform. And there's a reason for that. Holy shit, there's so much. But he never, ever, 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 ever treated us to the degree that he could with the fact that he had money. He always, of course, we always had privilege. I'm going to say that right now, but not to the degree where I knew that we had the money that we did ever. So we had this horse. I had the worst headstall, the worst saddle, the worst all the things, but I loved, looking back, I'm like, that was so smart because he made me work for it. He made me work for it. So I had to really show to him that I was very passionate. So I worked for it, man. I worked so hard. And then I'll never forget the year that he bought me like a legit quarter horse. And then I was all in. Another quick story about my dad is a lot of times I had to travel by myself to these rodeos because my parents were busy and 18 kids, no, 14 kids. And I was like, well, I need a trailer, obviously. Like it takes a lot. It's a very expensive sport. And there was one at the arena that, like I said, he raised purebred cattle. So he already he's been building this business and he had some of this stuff, but he wouldn't let me ride it until I learned how to back the trailer up all the way. Our driveway in our home is so long, and he made me back it up all the way to the barn. And it literally curves like this, like a huge S curve. And it was a bumper pole and it was so hard, but he taught me that discipline and hard work was the way that you got stuff done, that you literally created anything. It's not with money. No, it's not with money and things being handed to you. It's with really hard work. And I've continued that ethic in my own way throughout my life. Anyway, so here I am in rodeo and I loved it. And then all of a sudden I'm like this high schooler who's all of a sudden men are curious about me and I love it. And I get into trouble and I put myself in really scary situations that I unfortunately was manipulated in and that I was used and abused in. And I kind of just swept them under the rug because I was like, this is just what happens to girls. And I was also told you put yourself in those situations, right? And then one time it was really bad. It was my first time drinking ever. And I got super, super drunk and I had sex with a guy I didn't know. I'm sure, I actually think he was in college. I was in high school. It was not good. And up until that point, I had pretty much kept all of this secret. And after that happened, I thought, okay, I better tell somebody to help me get out of this rut. Help me fix everything that I was literally ruining. So I told my bishop and he told me to tell my parents. And I did. And it was hard, really hard. And back then repentance, right? I couldn't take the sacrament for 6 months. I couldn't date. I quit rodeo because I really believed that I wasn't strong enough to be in that environment. Because before that, I was really getting into it. And I can honestly say now that I believe I was being guided, even as a 17-year-old, to change the trajectory of my life, because there is a really good chance I would have ended up pregnant with a random cowboy's child if I had stayed in rodeo. But it was the hardest thing I'd ever done at that time. I felt dirty. I felt like a sinner. I felt depressed. That was the first time that I cut my wrists first and only time, because I wanted to feel physical pain versus the emotional pain that I'd felt. I just felt at such despair. I had let everybody down. And at one point, my father came to me and was crying and was like, if I go to every single rodeo with you, will you not quit? And I said, no, I can't be in this environment. And I lost all my friends. This was the summer before my senior year. I was supposed to be the Idaho rodeo team captain. I was supposed to go to rodeo in all of my events. Go to state in all of my rodeo events. I had already had some of scholarship to Utah State to go to Utah State for rodeo. It was my whole life. But I could see where it was going. At least back then, that's what it felt like. I just had no handle on anything. Everything I ate, I wanted to throw up. Every kind of intention I had, whether I liked the guy or not, I was clinging to it. And that's all I ever wanted, right? And it was just making me spiral and getting me into these really unsafe situations. And I realized I have to quit what I'm doing. I have to quit being in this environment. And the thing about rodeo is it's a wild crowd, but the people are just the best. The adults are the best. My roping coach, Jill, she's amazing. She was amazing. She's like a second mom to me. She called me and was like, "What are you doing?" And I was so terrified. I was so terrified that I lied to her. And I said, "My parents are making me quit." And as a 17-year-old with no prefrontal cortex and an undeveloped brain, that's literally what I felt like that was the only choice, because I was so embarrassed. How was I going to explain to all of my rodeo people that I just had to quit because I didn't feel like it was a safe environment? Like, that's not nice to them either. So I just did what was best. And then of course, Jill called my dad, and of course it got back to my parents, and I'll never forget, like, my dad pointing at me and saying, "This is real life, Sadie. You cannot do that. This is real life." And I regretted that life for a lot of years of my life because it took away a lot of trust from my dad. Anyway, I just felt like I had to quit. I had to quit rodeo. And it destroyed me. It took away all my friends pretty much. I'll never forget my friends being like, yeah, because I was on the roster, right, for the rodeo. And this was right before the rodeo season was supposed to start. And so I was on there, and they would call my name 3 times, "Sadie, Sadie." And then they'd be like, "We'll miss you this season." And this is what my friends are telling me that it was happening. And I was like, oh, I mean, I had a roping can with my name on it. I was like set to excel there. And I quit. I really felt like I had to move out of that life. And then I became like, I actually went up to my parents' ranch in St. Anthony that summer. I graduated when I was like not able to take the sacrament. And I'm actually going to not go into like explaining a lot about the church. I just wanted to give you a little bit of picture about like where I've been in that situation. Anyway, those 3 months were really difficult. I worked as a horse guide at a dude ranch, and I did so many horse rides, and I'd like be falling asleep on the horse. And I'm like, this is so lame. My life is so lame now. How am I ever going to get the spark back in my life? It was the worst. It was the worst summer. But I learned a lot, and it was really painful to go through that process with my parents and the judgment of what I had done and the judgment of everybody, literally everybody, knowing that I quit, and what that meant for my friends and my relationship and my life. And instead of, I was going to go into animal science. I was going to go to Penn State. I was going to go to Utah State for my undergrad. I was going to go and do rodeo and go to animal science. And then I was going to go to Penn State, become a vet. I shifted everything, and instead I went to nursing school at BYU, Idaho. So I went to BYU, Idaho, and I was like, okay, I'm going to be a good person now. And I still had the hopes of being a veterinarian. I've always loved helping living things, regardless of whether it was an animal or a human. So I walked into this animal science class, and even though I went to BYU, Idaho, I still wanted to be a vet. And it was awful. The class was awful. It was like about incubating eggs. And I was like, screw this. I am not doing this. And I walk out, and I'm like, okay, what am I supposed to do with my life? What am I supposed to do with my life? And it dropped in pretty clear. Back then I wasn't meditating. Back then I didn't have any self-awareness literally at all. But my mom was a nurse. My mom was an LPN before she met my real dad. And I always loved that. Like, I've always had a desire to help the humans, help living things, help animals, whatever. That's why I think I was so good at rodeo, because I connected with these horses so well. Little did I know that it was like therapy for me, therapy for everything I had been through in my childhood. And like, that's why I related to rodeo so much, because these animals literally just saved me. And then of course, going back to just helping people in general. That's why I became a nurse. I mean, it's just like all the full circle thing of like, that helps me, that literally saved me. So I want to say really quick, as a child, I always loved running up to kids in the playground if they got hurt and being like, my mom's a nurse. How can I help you? I've always just had a desire to help people. I could always feel if people are hurt physically or non-physically, mentally, whatever it was. And I always wanted to help. But I always also got pushed back because people were like, who is this energy? What is it? Little did I know it was me, my penetrating aura as a projector. Okay, so jumping back to college. So I get into nursing school and I bust through nursing school. I was really good at focusing on things. And I think that helped me a lot with my mental health. I really just dove into things. I actually believe it was just me trying to prove myself, consistently trying to prove myself. And I think that just comes from the fact that I came from one of 14 kids. I always got good grades in school. I always wanted to be the best at everything. And I really think it was just because I always wanted to prove myself. Whether that was good or not, it saved me in a lot of things. And I got a little bit into trouble in college, but honestly, I just didn't have time because nursing school was so intense. I graduated with my registered nurse degree when I was 20. I went into it quick and fast. And because I was so busy, I didn't really have a lot of time to mess around, right? I really appreciate the way that my parents raised me because they never handed me anything. Yes, I had privilege. Yes. However, I only got college paid for if I had a certain GPA, and nursing school is really, really difficult. And college was only paid for if I also had a job. So I always worked. I worked at answering phones in college, which was such a gift as a job. Well, I also worked as a waitress, but then when it got really intense with nursing school, I had to quit that job, and I only worked as answering phones on campus, which was such a gift because I could do my homework there. And then if I got based off of my GPA, my parents would buy me a car. Like they would have money towards a car. So if I had a 4.0, I'd have more money towards a car, or if I had, all those things. So it was such a gift and it was such a blessing. I actually graduated with my associate's registered nurse degree, which I actually don't think they do very often anymore, but that's how I graduated when I was 20. I was going to go on to go to my bachelor's and then become a nurse practitioner. I just had like big dreams. And I dated on and off in Rexburg, Idaho, and nothing ever really stuck. I dated a lot of guys. That part didn't really heal until I found Jeff. But I dipped my toes into a lot of people, into a lot of places, and just to like figuring out really what it was. And, in the Mormon culture, you get married really, really fast. You get to know people really fast, which actually worked in my favor because I don't really beat around the bush. I'm like, if I love you, I love you. I like can see in your soul, which growing up until maybe 5 years ago is actually it was not a blessing because I didn't realize other people didn't see their higher selves. I could see the potential and higher self of somebody. So I would let people in that way, not knowing that actually they weren't that person. That's where boundaries come in, but that's a whole nother podcast. Okay. And I think that's where we end this one. I think we started all over with me meeting Jeff. So just to paraphrase, just to like wrap it all up in a nice little confusing bow, I am now in college. I am graduating my nursing degree. I am completely shutting myself off from all emotional and spiritual feelings by keeping myself busy with finding a husband and getting through nursing school. I am completely unaware of self-awareness and self-love. And I am completely ignorantly happy with where I've found myself. And I'm consistently trying not to mess up every single day. Like to the point that it was probably unhealthy. This feeling of being worried that I was going to sin, being worried I was going to mess up, which then ultimately made me the perfectionist, made me the control freak. So whether it was a control of food, a control of allowing myself to be seen by men, a control of quitting rodeo so I could control my life, control of my college grades, control of my work. That's where I was, which is actually such a full circle because I almost didn't start this podcast because I wanted it to be perfect. So that is the imperfect, perfect story of my childhood, very, very, very briefly put, to my college years. And the next episode, we'll get into my marriage and how I found Jeff Sabin. And I'll leave you with a question. What are you going to do today to honor your wild? Love you so much.